Okay, short presentation. Basically, I'm doing this because I want to talk about one quote, and it's not in your book, so therefore I had to make a whole presentation that surrounds this one quotation that I want to talk about. All right, so let's see. I'll play. Mr. Cooper Bird Kramer. Whitney. It's really funny because when somebody turns in notebook paper with no name or other identifying information, and yet we're in a situation where hardly anyone ever comes to class with any degree of regularity, it makes it nigh impossible to actually identify said person's reading questions. And so said person may not get credit. So, I don't know what to do other than say, I think it's for this class. Anybody want to examine it? I'm filling out all the reading questions. I guess I'll keep these, isolated questions in case they're one day claimed. So anyway, here's some. Basically trying to work through my big stack of reading questions, trying to catch up with those. I wanted to have your reflection essays done today, but with a barrage of grading on the horizon and trying to catch up with these, it just simply, basically wasn't going to happen, at least not today. Lucy Baker, definitely not grading. Cooper's not here today. Carrick, not here. No. I always pick the best day to hand these back out too, because after an exam, nobody wants to actually come. But by that even in the best of times, pre-COVID times, the day after the exam was always one of the most, because it's sort of like, oh, we're beginning something new, therefore it must not be important. I can miss that day. That's why I love it when, again, in the before times, you'd have a student that would say, I'm not coming to class today. Are we discussing anything important? Oh no, we're just going to play Pinochle today. Actually, that was the game plan. So anyway, I'm making my way through these, and I'm uploading the results in Blackboard. Expect reflection 3 back. Well, remember, today is the last day that I'm going to see this particular class for 2 weeks, because you get next week off because that is election day. Even though I'm sure most people, if you're voting, have already voted, you still can take the day off and vote if you need to do that. But anyway, so that means I won't see you guys for 2 weeks, but just in the meantime, next Thursday, just keep up with the video lectures, the simulcast, right? We are, maintaining a strong schedule, trying to move forward, okay? When you guys come back, you'll have the exam, and I'll have reflection 3 for you. And by the way, you might have been thinking, Miriam, you asked about reflection 2. I looked my office and my files up and down. You might have been thinking about reflection 3. Yeah, because you put in Yeah. And I handed that back at I handed that out at like the end of September. So yeah, reflection 3, I've just not had time to get to it yet. So, but yes, that will be got directly soon. But again, the schedule will move on. We will have our fourth reflection essay this weekend. I figured, you've got two reflection essays. You kind of more or less know what I expect and how I grade on those. But, we can't really push anything else back, because if I'm going to get 5 in, as was my original intention, it's just kind of necessary that we move forward. And again, so only 2 left. You'll have one this weekend. It'll be over Kant. As a matter of fact, to sort of help draw the connection that I'm talking about today with Kant and Hume, it'll be over Kant and Hume. So, since we didn't do a reflection on Hume, you'll make up on it with that way. And then there's only one reflection left. Remember, and again, I'm not trying to alter your strategy. All I'm just trying to say is bear in mind, some students forget that I do drop the lowest reflection essay grade. You can do all 5. That's perfectly fine. And I'll grade them all. The lowest grade will get dropped. Conversely, if you have been good with your reflections and, you decide that either on this upcoming reflection or the last one, you just are like, well, I'm really busy right now and I want to take a break, fine. You can skip one. And again, the result's the same. Just don't skip 2. If you've already skipped one, I would recommend you really should do the rest of them. Because if I'm only counting 4, that means 1 0 would be 25% of that overall grade, right? And you don't want that, right? Reflections are important. I hope that you don't think they're just busy work, but actually I feel like, reflecting and trying to write out some of the ideas that you talk about in lecture related to some of these things that I ask about in the prompts should help you actually, I'm hoping, kind of get some of the subject matter more. But, because really one of the best ways to try to understand something is to write about it, right? And essentially what I'm already planning on asking you this weekend will be articulating some of Hume's thoughts and seeing exactly why they're important in relation to Immanuel Kant, our next philosopher. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Kant is definitely a game-changing philosopher. Some people say that only perhaps Plato, Aristotle, and Aquinas in the Middle Ages are of his rank. So Kant is a really tremendous deal. Kant made equal contributions to not only metaphysics and epistemology, our particular area of study, but also ethical theory. If you take an ethics class, you'll be talking about Kant too, because he did that too. Philosophy of religion, political philosophy. He's just one of those guys that sort of influenced and touched on a little bit of everything. An introductory quotation here: I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. So, as we go through Kant, kind of keep that in mind, because that's an illustrative quote for him. Kind of picking up on the theme that we saw with Hume about denying knowledge, but now making room for faith. What's all that about? Well, let's see. Anyway, so just a little bit of biographical stuff about Kant. He was born in a place called Königsberg, which at the time was a pretty metropolitan city in the northern part of Prussia, which is today actually a satellite state of Russia. I believe it's called Kaliningrad. So as a matter of fact, Königsberg doesn't exist as it was any longer. There is a major university that still exists there today, but now it's the University of Kaliningrad instead of Königsberg. There was actually on that campus a big statue of Kant memorializing him. But anyway, at that time it was part of Prussia. Because remember, now that we're getting into some of the German philosophers, thinking a little bit about the history of the German lands, remember, Germany was not a unified state until well into the 19th century, late 19th century actually. Before that, it was kind of a loose confederation of several different kingdoms and principalities, some of them very, very tiny, others quite big, like Prussia. And for years, it was loosely united under what was called the Holy Roman Empire, right? Except, again, it was, as someone famously commented, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But anyway, so Kant, again, Königsbergian, our first German philosopher. It's kind of funny because they say that he never traveled more than about 65 miles from his town, and yet he sort of influenced the world of philosophy. Anyway, so really Kant studied there, of course, as original traditional undergraduate and pursued graduate work there. Not too much interesting about Kant's life after he, he's basically the life of a scholar. After his time at the University of Königsberg, he was a Hofmeister, which at that time was a private tutor Essentially, it was sort of expected that like once you got your initial doctorate, you had to get 2 doctorates. And actually that still holds today in the German academic realm. You have to publish 2 books and that sort of solidifies you to make you eligible for university tenure. After his initial doctorate, he basically becomes a house tutor. It's a gig that you can do to take some time to work on your second doctorate and make a little bit of money. Eventually, Kant goes back to Königsberg after his time tutoring, and he teaches there as basically an unsalaried lecturer. This was very common in the time. It's sort of like the equivalent of today's adjunct or part-time instructor, except in those days, Kant would have been directly paid by the students. So, like rather than, he would have like a meager little, I guess you would call honorarium from the university, but students would actually directly pay their professors per class. So in order to make money, Kant, lectured and taught about literally everything. And in those days, if you were a philosophy professor, they were like, oh, well, you can do advanced mathematics and you can do geography and you can do anthropology and you can do basic, because at the time philosophy was like the mother discipline. So indeed, Kant lectured on just about everything, average about 20 hours a week. And Kant does this for really several years, from 1775 to 1770. And then finally in 1770, at the age of 46, he finally gets his tenure as appointed to the chair of logic and metaphysics at the Albertina, which was what the University of Königsberg was known as. And at that time occurs in Kant's life what was known as the silent decade. Now, scholars call it that because after years of teaching and productivity, Kant kind of, just stopped his excessive publishing rate. So, was it the case that Kant is just, sitting on his laurels and not really working on things any longer? Not quite. Indeed, Kant at the time was actually working on what was to be his most famous book. I meant to grab a copy of it this morning off my bookshelf. The Critique of Pure Reason. Okay, the Critique of Pure Reason. It's mammoth. It's about like 800 pages. A mammoth masterwork in philosophy, considered one of the most influential works in metaphysics and epistemology that's ever been published. Notice that this was published in 1781, and he was 57 years old that, he really had his masterwork. Before that, he was just kind of a average Joe Schmo, university professor. I mean, recognized in his field, but this was to become one of the most important works, again, in the history of philosophy. A second edition comes out in 1787, and actually following his first critique, you have a whole decade of productivity. So the silent decade, where he's working on his masterwork, his magnum opus, the Critique of Pure Reason. The following decade, you have a flurry of activity where Kant is publishing in almost virtually every field. So all that teaching maybe came in handy. So you have the first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason, that deals with metaphysics. Now, what we're focusing on in this class is the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, which more or less is kind of like Kant's own SparkNotes version of his major work, and which is kind of funny because I'm sure that upon reading this, you're kind of like, wow, this is pretty dense stuff. Yeah, imagine the critique itself, which is quite daunting, although brilliant. It's just really, really hard. And Kant knew this. That's why 2 years later, basically, as many philosophy texts have this fate, people read about maybe a third of it, and they're just like, either I don't understand it, or they attribute a bunch of conclusions that Kant himself didn't actually intend. So it was widely misunderstood and just kind of seen as crazy or, just incomprehensible. So Kant's like, okay, well, let me publish my little summary for you so that you can understand, which is also kind of like itself an advertisement, because he's like, well, if you want to get now the cooler arguments, read my big book, right? So, the Prolegomena is basically like an outline and summary of this major work, the Critique of Pure Reason. So we're kind of looking at both works in a sense, in that I'm using the Prolegomena as a guidebook to summarize and articulate the major conclusions of this monster work. You've already seen a quotation from his essay, What is Enlightenment, right? That's what I asked you guys to write on for this third reflection essay. Kant's quotation summarizing the Enlightenment and applying that to the spirit of Descartes. Kant was indeed working during the waning days of the Enlightenment period. In Europe, the Enlightenment or Age of Reason gave way to Romanticism, which was sort of like a counter-Enlightenment. Basically, the Enlightenment people were all like, oh, reason is superior, and the romantics were like, emotion and nature is superior. So you get more angsty people in the 19th century. And some people credit Kant with like as the transition post-Enlightenment to Romanticism. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. Notice how then Kant introduces a trilogy of critiques. Okay, so after the second edition of the first critique is published with substantial revisions, he publishes the critique of practical reason. Here focusing upon ethics and morality. And his third critique, the critique of the power of judgment, deals with, interestingly enough, the disparate topics of aesthetics. So a theory of the nature of what is beautiful, as well as what he calls the other category of aesthetic judgment. So we think of things as either beautiful or he calls it sublime. Sublimity is kind of an aesthetic experience of a more somber and serious kind of reaction, whereas beautiful things are pleasing. Sublime things, well, it kind of humbles you and makes you recognize the notion of a higher kind of power or higher order at work, right? Anyway, also the power of judgment, that critique deals with teleology, but in a post-critical way, not the Aristotelian kind of teleology, but just sort of, considering whether or not it's the case that nature is ultimately working toward human beings and human reason. Just an illustrative quote about Kant from a scholar who was that says, "I know of no decade in the life of any philosopher which even approaches this one in the quantity, variety, and importance of what Kant did in those 9 years. When one refers to Kant's philosophy without modifiers or qualifications, it's these works from the first to the third critiques which are meant." So what is it that Kant wrote about? Just here's a little summary that's kind of dense, but I will just sort of briefly go over it. What's Kant all about? What's this big unifying theme? He wrote so many things. Like, does he have a unifying sort of philosophy here? Well, one thing that recurs throughout Kant's critical period is human autonomy. That word autonomy for a moment, what does that mean? Yeah, exactly. Specifically like freedom specifically with the connotation of self-determination, from the Greek auto, meaning self, nomos, meaning norm or law. So literally you have a self-law, you are self-legislating, okay? So you do not simply act under the guidance of another, kind of like what he said with the Enlightenment piece, but rather you make your own determinations, your own norms, regulations, and laws for yourself. To be self-legislating is the very essence of human freedom, according to Kant. He argues that, and this is where things get a little wonky without the context, the human understanding is the source of the general laws of nature that structure all of our experience, and that human reason gives itself the moral law, which is our basis for our belief in God, freedom, and immortality. And thus, science and morality and religious belief are all mutually consistent and secure, because they all rest upon the same foundation of human autonomy, which is also the final end of nature, or the goal of nature, according to the teleological worldview of reflecting judgment that Kant introduces in the third critique to unify the theoretical and practical parts of his philosophical system. Woo! So, essentially, you can kind of see Kant wanted to unify and make consistent the disparate areas of human experience more generally. Our experience of science, our experience of religion, our experience of morality, our experience of art. All of that Kant wanted to make sort of unified and consistent rather than just sort of disparate domains of human experience. And that's why, Kant is sort of seen as one of the greatest systematic philosophers. He wants to integrate all these aspects of knowledge and experience and make them coherent and ultimately kind of rational in a way. And again, what's the linchpin? What is it that all of these aspects of human existence center around? Autonomy. The fact that human beings are self-legislating and even potentially the end of nature itself. Okay. But before we get to that big summary, let's talk about what he's doing in the Prolegomena for Any Future Metaphysics. Now, this book, the title, some philosophy titles are just, almost as opaque as what's inside. What is a prolegomena, or what actually are prolegomena, because that's actually a Latin plural term. It basically means preparatory study, okay? So a prolegomena would be like, almost like a preface in a way, but with a specific connotation of kind of like exercises, okay? So prep work. prep work to what? To Any Future Metaphysics? Well, what do you think Kant has in mind here? Well, what he has in mind is the idea of, in a post-Enlightenment, post-Humean world, is such a thing as metaphysics still possible? Is it even still legitimate? It's an area of inquiry, right? And to open the first critique, he has a preparatory dedication to Francis Bacon. We didn't talk a lot about, but Bacon is considered one of the early empirical scientists to develop something like a proto-scientific method. So Kant's immediately kind of signaling, in a kind of a Humean spirit, like, look, we're going to have to decide whether or not something like metaphysics is a legitimate area of inquiry for philosophy or science to even spend its time with. Is something like metaphysics still possible? Becomes a sort of a dominant theme in Kant's work. So, in his preface or his dedication in the first critique, of our own person, we will say nothing, but as to the subject matter with which we are concerned, we ask that men think of it not as an opinion, but as a work. Further, each may well hope from our insaturation that it claims nothing infinite, nothing beyond what is mortal, or in truth, it prescribes only the end of infinite errors, and this is a legitimate end. So Kant is basically suggesting we're going to get over the infinite errors of what? Metaphysics. Why? Because it just doesn't simply seem to teach us anything. Remember, consider the title of Kant's magnum opus, Critique of Pure Reason. Is pure reason, in and of itself, capable of getting to the truth about things? Interestingly enough, as harsh as Kant sounds here, he's going to end up being something like a moderate. But long had Kant been concerned with criticizing reason. This is an illustrated quote from 1764, so this is long before the masterwork was completed. But I just love this quote because it just, in a pithy way, summarizes part of the problem of what we've been experiencing this semester. Claims to philosophical cognition generally enjoy the fate of opinions and are like the meteors, the brilliance of which is no guarantee of their endurance. And what's Kant mean with this somewhat romantic, almost poetic characterization? See, by the way, it's not that these philosophers can't write. They can write very well. They just choose to write in very technical, difficult terms. So Kant sometimes can, really put things in a poetic way. But what's his point there? Right, and that's true. But just thinking about particularly this analogy between metaphysics and meteors, right? Brilliant, both of them may be, in a literal metaphorical sense. That is, brilliance in the term of brightness, but also in the terms of adequate and intelligent or all those kind of things. Yet, if you can catch a glimpse of a meteor, it's gone before you know it. And doesn't that seem to be the case with the metaphysics that we study? I mean, and we've only sort of scraped the surface here. There are so many philosophers offering especially in this period, their grandiose metaphysical systems, right? Their big argument to explain everything. But before you know it, a few years later, another philosopher comes along and it's like, well, that's nice, but they're wrong. and so they have their own metaphysical system. And then you have the rationalists on the one hand, and then you have the empiricists on the other hand. And all of them seem to give really good arguments. There's times when you're like, okay, Descartes, you're making a lot of sense here. But then you're like, oh, wait a minute, Hume's making a lot of sense too. So, who's right? What's right? And because of this sort of, bickering, and again, Kant is, like Hume, writing in a post-Newtonian world where modern science is getting a much more secure footing than metaphysics and philosophy. And think about how much progress science makes, right? Science, look, does it get stuff wrong? Sure. But can't you trace a linear progression of advancement? And within science, there's sort of a self-critical assessment that basically, allows for, when it makes mistakes, it can identify and correct those mistakes and continue to make progress. Metaphysics just kind of spinning out of control, And of course, you couple that with Hume's profound criticisms, you just sort of wonder if we're all wasting our time. Kant laments this state of metaphysics, and he says, there was a time when metaphysics was called the queen of all the sciences, and if the will be taken for the deed, It deserved this title of honor on account of the preeminent importance of its object. Now, in accordance with the fashion of the age, the queen proves despised on all sides. And I just want to highlight one thing from that quotation. It's clear what Kant's saying. Metaphysics once reigned supreme, but now seems to be the most despised of all the disciplines. And again, echoing Hume's staunch criticism. But notice that little passage here. If the will be taken for the deed, it deserves a title of honor. What does he mean by that? If the will be taken for the deed, then metaphysics does deserve the title as the queen of the sciences. What does he mean? Well, here we have to kind of ask a question. What is it that metaphysics is trying to do? Let's not think about it in an abstract sense, but in like a real human existential sense. What is metaphysics ultimately after?
The why?
The what?
The answer to the important questions like why.
Yeah, exactly. Why are we here? What are we doing? Does God exist? Do we have immortality? Are human beings fundamentally free? Right? These are the deepest, most existential questions. And philosophy says, well, okay, the best way we can approach these questions is through pure reason, right? And they construct these rational systems. But again, you sort of have to ask the question, are we getting anywhere? But Kant says, look, but if the will be taken for the deed, metaphysics is something that's important to human beings. And yet, at the same time, we have to wonder if our method is actually secure. So I highlight that because you can see Kant is somewhat sympathetic to the aim of metaphysics, but not to the method that is being employed, at least thus far. Kant's pretty big on method. And so metaphysics in the critique of pure reason ends up going on trial. That's what the critique of pure reason is. It's a trial of pure reason, a tribunal. And we're going to decide whether or not reason in its pure sense is entitled to its claims and to what extent it can actually perform or think about metaphysics. Reason should take on anew the most difficult of all its tasks, namely that of self-knowledge, and institute a court of justice, by which reason may secure its rightful claims while dismissing all its groundless pretensions. And this not by mere decrees, but according to its own eternal and unchangeable law. And this court is nothing other than the critique of pure reason itself. So it's time for reason to turn inward, not directed outward to, the nature of God, freedom, and immortality and all those kind of things, but inward to determine, is it capable of knowing the things that it claims to know? 2 quick points about that, by the way. Number one, do you see how Kant is once again following in Descartes' kind of footsteps? How Hume, Descartes, and Kant, despite all of their differences, do you see how they're all united around one singular question? And what is that? Remember the epistemological question. How do we know what we know? Is the mind capable of getting to truth? Right? All of them, sort of advocate this withdrawal and looking into the mind to analyze its nature and its foundations and all of these kind of things. So again, Kant, by the way, is sort of seen as the zenith of this epistemological period, right? So, Kant kind of takes the observations of Descartes and Hume in terms of, trying to discern the limits of our knowledge, and he erects an entire system out of it. So Kant is seen as sort of the zenith of this epistemological period in early to mid-modern philosophy. The second point, and this isn't something I want to make a big deal about, but just something for you guys to think about, is if reason is flawed, would it be able to critique itself? Like, put another way, we're using reason to determine the limits of reason, but if reason is limited, would it be able to identify its own blindnesses and weak spots? I'll just sort of tuck that in. That's a criticism that Hegel, another important philosopher, made not long after Kant was writing. Of course, he has very, very different views than Kant, but I'll just sort of let you think, like, hey, the self-criticism of reason, is this even a possible kind of task? I don't know. I'll give Kant the benefit of the doubt, but I just want to, sort of highlight that as a tension, potentially. Kant's system that he ends up founding here in the Prolegomena is known as Transcendental Idealism. Okay. when I teach a longer version of this class, I had to do some editing because, of course, of our abbreviated semester. I typically do another philosopher in the modern period. It gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit more about idealism. As for us right now, we haven't seen idealism yet. But in fact, you've seen it subtly all semester. What is idealism? The word idealism in philosophy is a very ambiguous term. It basically, ask three different philosophers what idealism is, you're more than likely to get three different answers. All right? At its most general sense, idealism basically means that reality is somewhat mental in character. Okay? Think about how this sort of ties in with the rationalist thesis. All right? Remember how we talked a lot about rationalism this semester, and one of the things I try to suggest with all their views about how knowledge doesn't come from sensation, and they appeal to innatism and the principles of sufficient reason, that they're basically trying to identify mind and reality, right? There's just, let's call it cognitive identity between thought and being, okay? You all with me so far? Idealism takes that in a different sort of direction. Idealism holds that two possibilities, and Kant's going to fall on one side of this. Number one, that literally the nature of the world or reality is thought or mind. So that, for example, the only thing that exists in truth are mind and ideas. So like, for example, the nature of the world is literally mental. That it's not material or corporeal substance that truly exists as a mind-independent substance, but fundamentally, the material is grounded in the mental. Okay? Kant resists this as a vestige of older, let's call it, rationalist metaphysics. And for Kant, his idealism is such that reality is mind-dependent. Not mind-independent, but mind-dependent. What do I mean to say that reality is mind-dependent? That categories that exist within the nature of human understanding literally structure and make possible human experience. Put another way, the world that we see, and he does hold that there is a world out there, independent, like there, it's not like it's like Descartes, it's all in the mind. There is a world out there. But the world out there, as it is represented to us, is structured and organized according to what he calls a priori mental concepts. Now, what's a priori again? Before experience. Experience, therefore, for Kant, becomes the product of a combination of two activities. Intuiting or sensing the world, sense data that we receive, and the structuring of that sense data through a priori categories that exist only within the mind. And thus the combination of sense and concept, their unity, is what makes, for Kant, experience possible. So sensation and concepts and their unity makes experience possible for Kant. Okay? Now, just saying that may not right now make a ton of sense, or maybe it does. Don't get too wrapped up in interpreting it. Essentially, the next 2.5 class periods are going to be our way of trying to literally make sense of what that means and why it's an important observation on Kant's part. But as an introduction, and again, this is the quote that I built all this around. This is a quotation that does not appear in your text, but comes from the preface to the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. All right? Now, this has become known as Kant's illustration of, quote unquote, the Copernican turn in philosophy. Who's Copernicus again? I talked about him a little bit during our transition from medieval to modern. That's right. He's the first modern philosopher, or natural scientist, and by modern, really, he was a Renaissance guy. But in the more modern world, in the 16th century, Copernicus was the first to posit a heliocentric solar system, okay, based upon his mathematical observations about the way that the planets, stars, heavens move.
Okay? We all lived at the same time as like Galileo.
Yeah, Galileo was probably maybe like 80 or 90 years after Copernicus, but not that. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that long, right? Yeah. Galileo was more like late 16th century, whereas Copernicus was like early, much earlier than that. But anyway, here's Kant. and trying to explain how his revolution in philosophy is analogous in two ways to the revolution in the sciences brought on by Copernicus. Now I say, and this is kind of important because it's easy to kind of misunderstand. Revolution, when Kant says it's a revolution or a turn, he means it in two senses. First sense, yes, just like in the scientific world, everything is kind of turned around, right? So it's revolutionary in the sense of advancing philosophy or providing a new insight. But the analogy in the second sense is even stronger for Kant. That is, it's not just analogous in the terms of just being a revolution, but in mirroring the methodology of Copernicus. All right, I'll try to explain this in a somewhat dense Kant quote here. Up to now, it has been assumed that all our cognition must conform to objects, but all attempts to find out something about them a priori through concepts that would extend our cognition have, on this presupposition, come to nothing. Hence, let us once try whether we do not get farther with the problems of metaphysics by assuming that the objects must conform to our cognition, which would agree better with the requested possibility of an a priori cognition of them, which is to establish something about objects before they are given to us. This would be just like the first thoughts of Copernicus, who, when he did not make good progress in the explanation of the celestial motions, if he assumed that the entire celestial host revolves around the observer, tried to see if he might not have greater success if he made the observer revolve and let the stars rest. Let's break a little bit of that down, okay? Again, in some ways, I don't want us to get too far ahead of ourselves, but on the other hand, I feel like if I can give you a little bit of a sketch of Kant's project in the big sense, when we get down in the weeds, it's not going to be so, whoa, because Kant's tough. Kant's tough. However, he's worth studying because if you can sort of wrap your head around it, it's quite profound. Up to now, it's been assumed our cognition must conform to objects. What does that mean? I'm going to make this small.
He's saying that we don't have internal, like we can't come up with internal concepts outside of what we experience.
Wait a minute. Oh, here we go. Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
It's wrong, but I think that
Maybe not.
like he's saying that we can only come up with concepts once we experience.
Kind of. So Kant's saying it's been assumed that our cognitions must conform to objects, but attempts to find out something about them a priori through concepts that would extend our cognition have come to nothing. Okay. So, let me make a little sketch. All right. I'll put this, actually, I have this sketch in a PowerPoint form. I'll put this complete thing on Blackboard so that you can get a sense of this discussion on your own, independent of the video or in-person lecture. But anyway, kind of think about what's the problem of philosophy so far in metaphysics, all right? On the one side, you have the knowing subject. And on the other hand, you have being. That's the abstract way of putting it. Reality, more generally, what's out there. And this is the object. Okay? All of the mind, all of the intellect. Our side, over here. What's the object? Well, call it what you want. Forms, substance, causation. Hume's particular question about the thing out there that we can't necessarily grasp in here. Up to now, it's been assumed that our cognition right? And again, cognition just means, the ability to gain knowledge through the intellect, right? Our ability to learn something, right? That it must somehow conform to the object. Philosophical question: what is the nature of reality? Answer: well, we're going to have to bridge this insurmountable gap, right, to what Kant's going to call the thing in itself, the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, that we have to somehow get out of our minds in order to ascertain what truly is, right? Rationalists will tell you, well, if you just use sensation, you can get a sense as to what things are. However, behind sensation, we don't know what's going on there, but that's fine. We just got to be, satisfied, like what Hume says, with our impressions. The rationalists say, well, forget about even using sensation. We can use something like innate ideas to bypass the wall of sensation in order to get us into the true nature of the thing in itself, right? That, we ultimately what Kant's suggesting is that the mind must itself conform to or gain cognition of objects that are independent of human experience, right? The world exists as it is, outside of human perceiving, and it's the job of the mind to penetrate that wall of sensation or accessibility in order to get to the true nature of things, right? And of course, every metaphysical philosopher thus far has given us a story about things that exist outside of the mind that we have to penetrate into, whether it be through impressions or experience or through some version of innatism. Aristotle and Hume, radically different philosophers, but they advocate a more empirical approach. Plato and Descartes obviously advocate an intellectual or innatism approach, all right? Kant says, what if that's wrong? Like, what if the fundamental way of thinking about philosophical problems since the time of Plato is fundamentally flawed? Like, we've been doing it wrong for 2,000 years. Let us once try whether we do not get farther with the problems of metaphysics by assuming that the objects must actually, in fact, conform to our mind, which would agree better with the requested possibility of an a priori cognition of them, which is to establish something about objects before they are given to us. We can know something about something about objects before they are given to us, because what Kant is suggesting is, what if the objects of experience are nothing other than the product of a mental conditioning of our experience? What if it's the case that the human understanding literally structures and makes possible human experience? For example, what if it's the case that when we normally think of causation, we think about it as sort of a mind-independent phenomenon? A causes B. Cue ball hits the 8-ball, and the 8-ball moves. Hume's answer to the problem of causation is to basically say that it's nothing more than constant conjunction. We don't see causation out there. But the way that he solves this problem is by suggesting that, therefore, causation, at least on the human side, the human cognition side, is nothing more than habit. So through a sort of a habituation, we just believe in something like causation. Kant says Hume's partially right because he recognizes that in root experience, causation is not something that occurred. We merely perceive constant conjunction. But what if causation isn't just like habit? What if it's a mental category that ultimately sense data is fed into, and that data is processed and interpreted, which makes possible the human experience of something like causation?
Still all up.
A little bit, not exactly though. But it's good you bring that up, because that's going to be the hopefully the next thing that I talk about. No, you're good. Put another way, causation and other problems in philosophy are no longer problems of things that are just out there. But what if all the big questions of philosophy, like substance and causation What if it's nothing more than, again, the way that the mind literally structures experience and thus gives that experience to us? What if it's in fact the case that we've been taking too much for granted the distinction between subject and object? Reality is maybe just nothing more than the product of our human conditioning. Now that's kind of important though, because Kant will maintain that there is something like a mind-independent reality. And of course, the question becomes, well, but what can we, okay, so we can talk about the world as a product of mental conditioning that is structured and made possible by the categories that are innate, or a priori, as Kant prefers. We'll talk about the distinction between Kantian categories and innate ideas a little bit later on. But like, okay, that's fine that, okay, mind structures experience and we can have answers to problems insofar as we understand the mental categories that structure and make possible that experience. But if there's a mind-independent world, what about that? Kant will say, what about it? He calls it noumena. Noumena comes from the Greek word nous, which means intellect. What Kant means is that is a world that is nothing more than an intellectual postulation. It's something that exists, but we can literally say nothing about it. It is a world that is things in themselves, and we have no access to that world. But ultimately, what Kant is suggesting is that metaphysics, at least as it was classically interpreted, is impossible because human beings can know nothing more than the world that is the product of their own mental conditioning through a priori concepts conjoined with what he calls intuitions, which means sensation. And that is what makes experience possible. What Kant essentially does is takes the problem of metaphysics and takes them from being objective problems and makes them more about subjective problems in terms of the way that the human mind conditions and makes possible human experience. So again, analogous to Copernicus, he said, Copernicus couldn't make any advancements if he assumed that he was at rest and the stars were moving around him. But he made advancements when it was the case that he was moving and the stars were standing still. So again, what is that? A reorientation of the focus of philosophy away from objective concerns to the subjective way in which the mind literally conditions and makes possible human experience. That's the Copernican turn in philosophy. So how is it that Kant's going to motivate this argument here? Well, before we get deeper into Kant, we first have to look at the preface to the Prolegomena, which you should have read in conjunction with the preamble, the preface and so all these interactions, which deals with, of course, David Hume. The connection between Hume and Kant is a unique connection. Not very often do philosophers so explicitly spell out their indebtedness to another important philosopher, but indeed Kant goes quite out of his way to talk about Hume and his problems. Remember, Hume's problem is not his beef with Hume, nor is it like, what's your problem, Hume? But it's the problem of induction, okay? And Kant's particular interpretation of that. Look at the bottom of page 2 in the Prolegomena. Kant says here, since the essays of Locke and Leibniz, I mentioned Locke, and I may have briefly mentioned Leibniz. Locke is an empiricist, and Leibniz is a rationalist, and both seen as very, very influential in the history of philosophy. Or rather, since the origin of metaphysics, so far as we know its history, nothing has ever happened which could have been more decisive to its fate than the attack made upon it by David Hume. He threw no light on this kind of knowledge, but he certainly struck a spark from which light might have been obtained, had it caught some inflammable substance, and had its smoldering fire been carefully nursed and developed. What he's saying is that, Hume gave one of the most decisive blows to metaphysics that has ever been, occurred in the history of philosophy. However, Hume didn't fully analyze the implications of his ideas. And that's what he means by, it needed, his little spark needs some sort of flammable substance in order to make it truly burn. And of course, what's Kant thinking? I'm going to be the gasoline that's poured on the spark of Hume, but I'm going to, do things a little bit differently than Hume did them. And what is it that Hume did? Well, he started mainly from a single but important concept in metaphysics, namely that of the connection of cause and effect. He challenged reason, which pretends to have given birth to this concept of herself, to answer him by what right she thinks anything could be so constituted that if that thing be positive, something else must also necessarily be positive. Again, the necessity part being the important part. He demonstrated irrefutably that it was entirely impossible for reason to think a priori and by means of concepts such a combination as involves necessity. We cannot at all see why, in consequence of the existence of one thing, another must necessarily exist, or how the concept of such a combination can arise a priori. Hence, he inferred that reason was altogether deluded with reference to this concept, which she erroneously considered as one of her children, whereas in reality is nothing but a bastard of imagination, impregnated by experience, which subsumed certain representations under the law of association and mistook a subjective necessity, custom, for an objective necessity arising from insight. So that's Hume's very colorful summary of Hume's analysis of causation. And again, just to reiterate, and this is kind of what I was talking about before, but of course, Kant's taking this in very, conceptual technical language here. But what is he suggesting? What is it that Hume did? He showed that the concept of causation is not one that involves, what do we call it? Necessary connection, but is rather a subjective association based upon not necessity, but habit or custom. But the rationalist type thought that the principle of sufficient reason, the principles of causality, were those grandiose a priori innate principles produced by nothing other than reason itself. But it ends up being nothing more, not the child of reason, but the bastard of imagination, impregnated by experience, right? And of course, Kant's being colorful here because he's trying to essentially kind of mock the rationalist notion of the innatism of something like the principle of cause and effect. That, again, causal connections can't be necessary because, remember, what did Hume say are the only things that are necessary? Relations of ideas. And relations of ideas are only a priori, right? AKA before experience. Based upon what principle? The principle of contradiction. Okay? Only formal mathematical reasoning based upon the principle of contradiction can give us something like necessity. It's analytical, it's definitional. Hume is pointing out that causality, because it's not a conceptual relating of ideas, but rather it is from experience. Necessity can never actually occur. So it takes the principle of causality away from its rational pedestal and makes it only subjective. Okay? And again, Kant, sort of concludes on page 4. And this is important. It showed, Kant really understood Hume very well. And he said here in the middle of the top paragraph on page 4, the question was not whether the concept of cause was right, useful, and even indispensable for our knowledge of nature. For this, Hume had never doubted. He never doubted that cause is important or, useful. Of course it is. But here's what Hume was interested in, whether the concept could be thought by reason a priori. Now, again, what does Kant mean when he says whether or not the concept could be thought by reason a priori? Whether or not the principle of causation is something not derived from experience, but rather is innate. See, Kant is sort of linking the principle of necessity with innatism. Because what Hume tried to illustrate is that all things that come from experience, any judgment we make about experience, can never contain the principle of necessity. See, it's really important that you sort of consider the rationalists, when they're making these claims, this is one of the reasons that I get critical when anybody puts on their exam or reflection papers beliefs. Oh, well, this is what Kant believes, or this is what Descartes believes. Descartes' not talking about something he believes. He's saying that, my arguments about God, substance, mind, and body in nature are as necessary as 2 + 2 = 4. So they're arguing, again, a kind of an absolute necessity here. And they're doing so because they're appealing to this notion of the necessity of reasoning, right? Again, a logic class would really be helpful here. But remember when I talked about deductive reasoning, like conclusions that follow necessary, like true premises, and the conclusions are necessary because of the structure of the reasoning? Again, the rationalists wanted to attribute that kind of necessity to the world or nature itself, that there really is a necessary ordering in the world, principle of sufficient reason, and all that. Hume destroys this because he tries to say that necessity can only occur conceptually, definitionally, analytically. So it's not to do away with causation, but whether or not it could be thought by reason a priori, and consequently, whether it possessed an inner truth independent of experience, implying a more widely extended usefulness. Like, for example, something can't come from nothing, right? We're not just talking about billiard balls and things like that, but we're talking about, like, is it the case that the world must have a necessary cause, right? That if something can't come from nothing, that means the universe has to have an uncaused cause, right? Whether it had an inner truth independent of all experience, implying a more widely extended usefulness, not limited merely to the objects of experience. This was Hume's problem, okay? And I want you to remember that. Shorthand, remember I referred to it as the problem of induction. But again, I'm using problem of induction as an illustration here. Notice how Kant is sort of trying to make much more explicit than Hume made it the implication of, the problem of causation, right? And its implications for the possibility of metaphysics. And again, how is Kant understanding metaphysics? The attempt to get to things that exist independent of the mind by means of some kind of inner truth inherent to the mind, aka innate ideas. Hume raises the problem of causation by appealing to, as Kant illustrates, the origin of the concept of cause. And of course, where does Hume say it comes from? Nothing other than experience, which means that the concept of cause can only yield probable and never necessary results. Cause is not based upon reason, but is based rather upon habit or custom. This is crucial because Kant says, I agree with Hume 3/4 of the way, but that 1/4 is going to be pretty darn important, okay? What he says is that Hume's problem is this problem of causation and necessity in causation, and what is the true nature and origin of the human concept of causality. He agrees with Hume that causation is not something out there, but it is something in here. But Kant says, I reject the notion that causation is nothing more than habit. I reject that it's merely some sort of instinctual way of associating our ideas. Kant's going to say that rather than being habit, it's going to be an a priori mental category or a concept. The big difference between Kant and Hume, Kant's not going to take the skeptical or the rationalist approach, the skeptical or naturalist approach that Hume's going to take. Kant is going to hold to an important higher order of the understanding of the human mind, that it is not custom or some sort of principle of instinct that governs our understanding of nature, but rather a mental category, something about the mind. Remember, Kant, at the end of the day, is going to be an idealist. But his idealism suggests that human experience in the world is a product of a mental conditioning of that world. mental categories. Okay? So Kant is going to salvage causation, and he's going to say that causation, in fact, is necessary. Why? Because we could never conceive the world in any other way. Causation is a necessary condition for the possibility of human experience. That's going to become a refrain for Kant. You're going to hear it quite often. A necessary condition of the possibility for experience. The condition for the possibility of human experience. Put another way, Kant is going to say the reason that causation is actually necessary connections is because the necessity of causal connections is established a priori, aka before experience. Causation is necessary, but only in the sense that it structures and makes possible human experiences. Kant's going to say, could you imagine a world that isn't ordered causally? Of course you can. But the reason you can't is not because causation exists in the world, but because we bring it to the world as a principle of organizational structure. Because causation is a human mental category, a concept, a priori in the mind, that makes possible all experience. You could not imagine a world without causation because it's literally like a mental filter through which your senses have to go through in order to be intelligible for you. and that's, again, illustrative of this Copernican turn. Now, as cool as that is to say, at the end of the day, we're philosophers, and we say, what's your argument? Well, the critique of pure reason is the argument, but we're going to give the Spark Notes version of it in here, or at least something slightly better than the Spark Notes version. But anyway, Hume begins by saying, okay, in order to flesh out our response to Hume's problem. So, by the way, one way to sort of think about Kant's strategy here in the Prolegomena, which is, again, basically a way of summarizing and trying to make coherent all the hard stuff in the critique. Unlike the first critique, he takes the strategy of setting up this polemic with Hume. So again, he says, I'm indebted to Hume. But Hume is dangerous because since he reduces causation merely to habit and custom, he has condemned philosophy to skepticism. Clutching our pearls. Because what Kant wants to do is not kill metaphysics altogether, but to reimagine it. That's why, the book isn't called The Death of All Metaphysics. It's called The Prolegomena to Future Metaphysics, right? Kant thinks that not only that, if all of the important things about human mind are attributed nothing more than to habit and instinct, what's that say about the human mind? We're just not really rational. And that really, in a way, philosophy itself almost becomes kind of moot. Kant wants to say humanity is rational. And one of the primary reasons for defending rationality contra Hume, I said it in the very beginning of the class, because Kant is a defender of human autonomy. Kant thinks that if we reduce the mind to nothing more than kind of natural impulses, then human freedom can be called into question. It's certainly not the origin of the debate, but it's certainly one of the most important articulations. Hume is going to be one of the more important. This is something I would have talked about if I would have had just one more day on Hume. But Hume defends something like what he called compatibilism. And to be clear, compatibilism is basically the view that on the one hand, some philosophers will argue for literal hardcore determinism, that there is nothing like free will, all is determined. On the other hand, of course, you have Descartes, who would probably be the most clear exponent of somebody that thinks that literally human beings are 100% free. Like, we live in this mechanistic world, but because the mind is free, the mind can always determine its own principles. Because, again, mind stuff is literally of a distinct substance from body stuff. So mind literally operates according to its own principles. So literal absolute freedom. Hume says, well, we just need to reimagine the categories of things like liberty and necessity. He sees liberty as nothing other than, well, look, do you feel like you're the author of your own actions? I mean, if you think about it, freedom is nothing more than being able to act according to your own desires. If you desire X and can't actually do it without any kind of external impediments, then you are free to that extent. But then you might say, but what about like the causal determination that exists within the mechanistic world, right? And like, what about if we're just like a bundle of neurons and biochemicals in our brain, and that's just what makes us act in the way that we do? Well, Hume would say, well, but you got to remember, what did we say about necessary connections? We don't know if they're ever really necessary. So you can never attribute an absolute effect to any kind of absolute cause. So human activity may be, let's call it, probably determined to some extent. And he says, well, just look at human history. I mean, human beings act in very predictable behavior, actually. If you really think about it, human beings are always doing the same dumb stuff all the time. So therefore, there is a kind of determinism in the sense that human behavior is regular and predictable. But because we can't know the necessary connection of exactly what causes any motivation or humans to be able to act, you can never attribute absolute necessity to human motivation. But insofar as human beings have the ability to act according to the principles that they themselves desire, they feel to be the author of their own actions, they are free. So therefore, determinism and freedom are compatible in the sense that we don't know the extent to which we are determined, and we don't feel any kind of constraint or impediment to our choices. So there you go. But Kant's going to say, I think you just made an argument for us being determined. that Hume's compatibilism is a very soft compatibilism that ultimately rests on the skeptical notion that, like, well, I can't literally know all the causes of my choices, but I can say that human behavior is heavily predictable. And that fuels, Hume's overall psychological orientation. He's like, look, we couldn't develop a philosophy of human nature unless human beings literally did the same kind of stuff all the time. Hume famously says, look, you can leave like a bag of gold coins on steps, and I'll tell you one thing that I know won't necessarily happen, that it's going to be gone in about 20 minutes. So human beings act in similar ways, and they're very, very predictable. But he still thinks that because causation is never necessary, there's always room for the possibility of human freedom. And as long as human beings feel they're free to some kind of extent. Kant just says, no way, Jose. Human beings are free. Because human beings are something over and above their natural impulses or instincts. And by the way, that becomes very important in Kant's writings on morality, which, remember, I call it the second critique. So Kant is essentially trying to respond to Hume's problem. He wants to preserve Hume's insight that causation is subjective, but he wants to challenge the notion that it's merely something habitual and instinctual, because he thinks that's too skeptical for us to conclude, because it calls into question things like human autonomy. All right. Now, really quickly, Hume begins by saying, all right, we need to sort of consider the different types of judgments that we have. All right. Now, Kant distinguishes judgments in kind of four different ways. All right. Let's say two pairs. On the one hand, he looks at judgments that are, or he says that all judgments are either analytic. And I'll make this my last point, because I know that I'm running out of time. They're either analytic or they're synthetic. In some ways, these categories overlap with Hume, but Kant's going to interpret them a little bit differently. All right? On the other hand, judgments can be a priori, before experience, and also a posteriori. And remember, that's just the opposite, those that pertain to experience. Now, what's an analytic judgment? For Kant, an analytic judgment relates roughly to Hume's relations of ideas. It is a judgment where you are merely explicating a concept and not amplifying it. Put another way, the truth of a concept the truth of a judgment that is analytic, the conclusion is basically within the subject itself. Okay? To put it another way, if I were to say, well, all bachelors are unmarried, that's necessarily true because it's part of the very definition. Very, very good, right? Or, all bodies are extended because the nature of body is that it is extended. That's right. Gold is a yellow metal. Okay, well, of course, because that's what it is. Now, are analytic judgments a priori? Of course, because insofar as they are merely definitional, they never need to appeal to anything other than the concept or the definition as such. Again, analogous to the Humean relation of ideas. Synthetic judgments are judgments that don't come merely from the definition or the concept, but they amplify a concept or a definition. They go beyond the scope of the concept. I know a bachelor named Steve who lives in an apartment downtown. Well, that's not part of the concept of bachelor. This piece of gold weighs 5 ounces. Okay, well, the particular weight or the particular determinations of any piece of gold are not within the universal conception of what gold is, right? So anything that amplifies a concept is a synthetic judgment. And those clearly are all, at least thinking about this initially, a posteriori. Because what does experience do? It amplifies our knowledge of concepts by giving us additional information that those concepts pertain to. Okay, you with me so far? Can an analytic judgment be a posteriori? Can analytic judgment ever pertain to something within experience? I mean, again, we said that we can apply a concept to experience, but at that point, it becomes a synthetic judgment because we're going beyond the domain of the concept. So really, no, because analytic are always definitional, and insofar as they are definitional, they are always a priori. Okay? That leaves us with one little box left. A synthetic a priori judgment. What is that? Can somebody translate that? Basically, time to go, but I want somebody to translate this real quick. What would be a synthetic a priori judgment? How would you explain it? Synthetic means adding some kind of knowledge that goes beyond the scope of any given concept. A posteriori, a priori would be. So a synthetic a priori judgment would be amplifying our knowledge about something prior to experience. Why? That sounds like exactly the kind of thing that metaphysics tries to do. So Kant kind of gives a classification of the type of judgments that he thinks are the peculiar judgments of metaphysics. They are synthetic a priori judgments. So I said, on the one hand, the Prolegomena is a response to Hume's problem. On the other hand, it has one general question, as Kant formulates it in the preamble, which is essentially, and again, this is on page 18. I'm slightly rewording it, but how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? AKA, is it possible to expand our knowledge about anything prior to experience? It's the same question as, is metaphysics at all possible? We're going to find that Kant is going to divide this question into 3 separate questions. They will deal respectively with each of the 3 parts of the Prolegomena, and he's going to sketch this whole idealist conception that we talked about, the structuring of our experience through mental categories. And he's going to return to the question of metaphysics. Spoiler alert, not in the traditional sense will metaphysics be possible. Kant is essentially going to deal the death blow to classical rationalism and the metaphysical project as we know it, but with giving us new problems, of course. But anyway, I'll see you guys later.
reflection thing you said was probably gonna be fun this weekend, that'll be due on Tuesday, like usual, right?
Mhm.
We usually do it on Black.
Oh yes, that's
Because we
right.
won't be here
So
that
so
Tuesday.
um